Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. That delightful period when revenge wasn't just served cold, it was served with a side of creative brutality and a complete disregard for proportional response. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's wander through some of the pettiest, most elaborate, and frankly, exhausting acts of medieval vengeance. Because nothing says good night quite like stories of people who held grudges for literal decades. Now, when we think about revenge in the medieval period, we're not talking about leaving someone a passive-aggressive note or unfriending them on social media. No, medieval revenge was an art form. It required patience, resources, and often a willingness to involve entire kingdoms in your personal drama. These weren't people who believed in letting things go. Forgiveness? Never heard of her. Let's start with a woman who turned personal humiliation into a decades-long campaign of destruction. Her name was Fredegund, and she was a Frankish queen in the 6th century. Now, Fredegund started out as a servant, because of course she did. She caught the eye of King Chilperic Fur of Neustria, which sounds romantic until you realize he was already married, to a woman named Audovera, who had given him 3 sons. Fredegund's solution to this inconvenient wife problem was straightforward. She convinced Chilperic that Audovera's own children were illegitimate, which is quite the claim, really. Audovera was forced into a convent because nothing says, "I'm totally guilty of adultery," like being shipped off to become a nun against your will. With wife number 1 out of the way, Fredegund moved up in the world. But then Chilperic went and married someone else entirely, a Visigothic princess named Galswintha. Now, Galswintha was, by all accounts, perfectly pleasant. She was also fabulously wealthy, which made her even more pleasant in Chilperic's eyes. But Fredegund wasn't about to be replaced by some Spanish princess with better political connections. So Galswintha mysteriously died, strangled in her bed. What a tragedy. What an absolute mystery. Fredegund naturally had nothing to do with it. She just happened to marry King Chilperic shortly afterward. Funny how that works. But here's where the revenge really begins, because Galswintha had a sister, Brunhilda. And Brunhilda was not the forgiving type. She was married to Sigebert the Fur, who ruled the neighboring kingdom of Austrasia, and she spent the next 40 years making Fredegund's life absolutely miserable. These 2 women turned the Frankish kingdoms into their personal battlefield, and honestly, it's exhausting just thinking about it. Fredegund responded to Brunhilda's hatred with more murder, obviously. She had Brunhilda's husband Sigebert assassinated. Just sent some guys with poisoned knives to stab him while he was on campaign. Because if you're going to commit regicide, why not add poison to really make a statement? Brunhilda, grief-stricken and furious, survived and continued plotting. The body count between these 2 women is genuinely impressive. Fredegund had multiple assassination attempts on Brunhilda and her sons. She sent hired killers disguised as beggars. She allegedly tried to have Brunhilda's children poisoned. At one point, she had one of Brunhilda's sons murdered and his pregnant wife killed along with him. The commitment to vengeance here is almost admirable, in a deeply disturbing way. Brunhilda, for her part, outlived Fredegund by several years. You'd think she might have relaxed, taken up gardening, enjoyed her twilight years. But no. She continued feuding with Fredegund's sons and grandsons, because revenge doesn't have an expiration date, apparently. Eventually, Brunhilda's own nobles turned on her, probably exhausted by all the drama, and she met a spectacularly unpleasant end at age 70. Tied to a wild horse and dragged to death, which seems excessive even by medieval standards. The Fredegund-Brunhilda feud lasted longer than most modern television series and involved considerably more murder. It destabilized 2 kingdoms, resulted in countless deaths, And all because one woman strangled another woman 40 years earlier. The Franks really knew how to hold a grudge. Let's drift over to England now, to a revenge story that's equally petty, but involves significantly more paperwork. This is the tale of King John and the barons who absolutely hated him. And they had good reasons, to be fair. John was not great at being king. He lost most of England's territory in France, which earned him the delightful nickname John Softsword. Nothing screams medieval masculinity quite like being called soft, in sword terms, by everyone. But John's real talent was making enemies. He was paranoid, vindictive, and had a habit of sleeping with his barons' wives and daughters, which is generally not a great way to build loyalty among your nobility. He also taxed everyone into oblivion to fund his failed military campaigns. The barons were getting tired of this behavior, very tired. The leader of the anti-John faction was a baron named Robert Fitzwalter. Now Fitzwalter had a personal grudge against John because John had allegedly tried to seduce, or possibly rape, the sources are unclear, Fitzwalter's daughter. She refused and mysteriously died shortly afterward. Poisoned, according to Fitzwalter. The king was at this point accumulating enemies faster than a modern politician accumulates scandals. So Fitzwalter and a group of barons decided on revenge. But instead of just assassinating John, too quick, too easy, they came up with something more humiliating. They were going to force him to sign away his own power, in writing, with witnesses. They assembled an army, marched on London, and basically held the king hostage until he agreed to their terms. And that's how we got the Magna Carta in 1215, one of the foundational documents of Western democracy, born entirely out of spite. The barons wanted John to suffer the indignity of publicly admitting he'd been a terrible king and promising to do better. John signed it naturally, while probably grinding his teeth into powder. But here's the thing about King John. He was also petty. The moment the barons left, he sent a message to the Pope asking for the whole thing to be annulled. Because of course he did. The Pope, who was Team John for complicated political reasons, agreed. The Magna Carta was officially worthless within weeks of being signed. This did not go over well with the barons. Fitzwalter was furious. They'd gone to all that trouble, the army, the siege, the drafting of constitutional documents, and John just cancelled it. So they decided to escalate. If John wouldn't be their king, they'd find a new one. They literally invited Prince Louis of France to come invade England and take the throne. That's some serious commitment to revenge. You won't respect our document? Fine. We'll install a French king instead. England descended into civil war. John spent the next year desperately trying to hold on to his kingdom, while his own barons actively worked to replace him. And then, in the most anticlimactic ending possible, John died. Dysentery, probably, though some sources suggest he ate too many peaches and drank too much cider. A king brought down by fruit and poor digestion. Not exactly the heroic death medieval chroniclers preferred to write about. The barons got their revenge in the end, though, because after John died, his 9-year-old son became king, and the regents reissued the Magna Carta. So Fitzwalter and his friends got what they wanted. A public, legally binding humiliation of the monarchy. It just took an extra year and a convenient royal death. Let's meander over to Italy now, to the city of Siena in the 13th century. This is where we meet a man named Provenzano Salvani, who was a military leader and basically ran the city for a while. Provenzano was very successful at war, which made him very popular in Siena and very unpopular everywhere else in Tuscany, particularly in Florence, which was Siena's main rival. Now, Provenzano made the mistake that many successful military leaders make. He got overconfident. In 1269, he led a Sienese army against Florence at the Battle of Colle Valdelsa, absolutely certain of victory. He was so certain, in fact, that he allegedly said he'd eat his meal on the battlefield that evening. Spoiler alert, that's not what happened. The Florentines, who were very motivated by their intense dislike of Provenzano specifically, fought with unusual determination. They broke the Sienese lines, routed the army, and found Provenzano among the casualties. He'd been killed in the fighting, which was unfortunate for him but very fortunate for the Florentines, who now had his body. Here's where the revenge gets creative. The Florentines wanted everyone to know they'd defeated Provenzano, so they cut off his head. Then they paraded it through the streets of Florence on a pike. Then, and this is the part that really shows commitment, they sent it back to Siena as a gift. Here's your leader back. Well, part of him. You're welcome. The humiliation was absolute. Siena had lost its military commander, its army, and its dignity, all in one afternoon. Provenzano's head became a symbol of Florentine victory for years afterward. Dante even mentioned him in the Divine Comedy, placing him in purgatory for his pride. Being mocked by Dante was essentially the medieval equivalent of going viral for all the wrong reasons. But the Florentines weren't done with Siena. They used their victory to dominate Tuscan politics for the next several decades, constantly reminding the Sienese of that day when Provenzano Salvani thought he'd be eating dinner on the battlefield and instead became a rather gruesome party decoration.
Let's drift northward now to the Holy Roman Empire, where we find a revenge story so convoluted it requires a family tree and several deep breaths. This is the tale of the House of Welf versus the House of Hohenstaufen, a feud that lasted for over a century and made everyone involved absolutely miserable. It started with two families who both wanted to be Holy Roman Emperor because apparently being King of Germany wasn't glamorous enough. The Welfs and the Hohenstaufens spent the 12th and 13th centuries alternately fighting, betraying, and occasionally murdering each other in their quest for the imperial crown. This wasn't a quick, decisive conflict. This was generations of men dying over a title that mostly involved disappointing administrative work and constant travel. The key figure on the Welf side was Henry the Lion, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony. Henry was powerful, wealthy, and deeply unpleasant to deal with. He had a habit of refusing to help the emperor, Frederick Barbarossa of the Hohenstaufen family, whenever Frederick needed military support, which is generally frowned upon when you're a duke and the emperor is literally your feudal lord. At one particularly crucial moment, in 1176, Frederick needed Henry's help for a campaign in Italy. Frederick actually got down on his knees and begged Henry to bring his troops. Henry said no, just flat out refused, because he was busy with his own territorial disputes in the north and couldn't be bothered. Frederick lost the campaign, was humiliated, and added Henry's name to his list of people who needed to suffer. Frederick spent the next years systematically destroying Henry's power. He turned the other German nobles against Henry, accused him of various crimes, and eventually put him on trial. Henry was stripped of his duchies, his lands were confiscated, and he was forced into exile. His entire carefully built power base gone, all because he couldn't be bothered to help the emperor that one time. But here's where it gets interesting, because Henry's family didn't forget this humiliation. The Welfs spent the next several generations working against the Hohenstaufens at every possible opportunity. They sided with the Pope during imperial disputes. They supported rival claimants to the throne. They basically made it their family mission to ensure no Hohenstaufen could rule peacefully. The feud culminated with Frederick II, who was Henry the Lion's great-nephew, through a truly complicated set of marriages. Frederick II was one of the most fascinating medieval rulers. He spoke 6 languages, kept a menagerie of exotic animals, wrote a book about falconry, and was excommunicated by the Pope multiple times. He also continued the family tradition of holding grudges. Frederick II's entire reign was essentially a prolonged act of revenge against everyone who had opposed his family. He spent decades fighting the Pope, the Italian city-states, and various German nobles who had the audacity to suggest maybe he should pay attention to Germany occasionally instead of living in Sicily, surrounded by his exotic animals. The Hohenstaufen dynasty ended not with a bang but with a whimper in 1254, when Frederick II's line died out. The Welfs had their revenge, though it took them about a century and cost countless lives. Was it worth it? Probably not, but that's never stopped anyone from pursuing elaborate vengeance. Let's wander over to France now, where we encounter Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, not because he was particularly just or equitable, but because he was supposedly quite handsome. Medieval nicknames were delightfully literal sometimes. Philip was king of France in the early 14th century, and he had a problem. He was constantly broke. Running a kingdom is expensive, it turns out. Wars are expensive. Building projects are expensive. Maintaining a lavish court is expensive. Philip needed money, and he wasn't particularly bothered about how he got it. His solution was to target the wealthiest group in France who could undefectively fight back, the Knights Templar. Now, the Templars were a religious military order who had gotten extremely rich over the previous 2 centuries. They'd started as warrior monks protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land, but by Philip's time, they were essentially international bankers with fortified monasteries across Europe. They had so much wealth that kings borrowed from them, including Philip, who owed them substantial sums. Philip's revenge on the Templars for the crime of being rich and existing, really, was spectacularly thorough. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, yes, that's where the Friday the 13th superstition comes from, Philip had every Templar in France arrested simultaneously. Hundreds of knights, all taken into custody at dawn in a coordinated operation that required serious planning. Then came the accusations. The Templars were charged with heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, and various other crimes that were almost certainly invented. Philip needed these charges to stick so he could seize all their property legally. So he used torture, extensive, creative torture. Under torture, many Templars confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, because that's how torture works. The trials dragged on for years. Dozens of Templars were burned at stake. The Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, was kept in prison for 7 years before finally being executed in 1314. As he burned, he allegedly cursed both Philip and the Pope to die within the year, which they did, but that was probably coincidence rather than supernatural intervention. Probably, Philip got what he wanted. All the Templar wealth in France was confiscated and added to the royal treasury. The order was officially dissolved by the Pope, who was under Philip's influence at the time. It was a perfect revenge against an organization that had actually wronged Philip in any way except by being rich and making him feel poor by comparison. The Templars were never reconstituted, though various groups have claimed to be their successors over the centuries. Philip's revenge was so thorough that he didn't just destroy his victims, he erased them from existence entirely. That's commitment. Let's drift across the channel again to England, but a century earlier this time, to meet Fulk de Bruckheer. Fulk was what medieval chroniclers politely called a soldier of fortune and what we might call a professional thug with delusions of grandeur. He was born in Normandy, probably illegitimate, definitely without land or title, and he made his career by being extremely good at violence. During King John's reign years, that King John from earlier Fulk became one of the king's enforcers. When John needed someone beaten, robbed, or intimidated, Fulk was the man for the job. This made Fulk very unpopular with basically everyone except John, but it did earn him wealth, land, and eventually a somewhat tenuous claim to nobility. When John died and his son Henry III became king at age 9, Fulk thought he'd continue his career of intimidation and violence under the new regime. The problem was that Henry's regents were trying to actually govern England properly, which involved enforcing laws and respecting people's rights. Revolutionary concepts that Fulk found deeply offensive. Fulk had a particular grudge against a judge named Henry de Braybrooke. We don't know exactly what sparked their feud. Maybe Braybrooke ruled against Fulk in some legal matter. Maybe they just disliked each other personally. Medieval sources aren't always clear on motivation. What is clear is that Fulk decided the appropriate response was to kidnap the judge. In 1224, Fulk's men seized Braybrooke, dragged him to Bedford Castle, which Fulk controlled him, threw him in the dungeon, just kidnapped a royal judge, and locked him away. This was, even by medieval standards of casual lawlessness, a bit much. The regents were not amused. They sent messages demanding Braybrooke's release. Fulk responded by keeping him imprisoned. Because Fulk wasn't great at reading political situations, the regents assembled an army and laid siege to Bedford Castle. Fulk wasn't even there. He'd gone to Wales on some other bit of violent business, so his garrison held the castle without him. The siege lasted for 8 weeks, which is a long time to be stuck in a castle, eating progressively worse food, and wondering if your employer is going to show up and save you. Spoiler, he didn't. When the castle finally fell, the regents were furious. They had to spend royal resources besieging a castle in England, because one man could unfollow basic laws. So they made an example of the garrison. 80 men were hanged, just executed en masse as punishment for following Fulk's orders. Medieval justice was not subtle. Fulk himself managed to escape to France, where he lived out his days in exile, stripped of all his English lands and titles. His revenge against one judge had cost him everything. The kidnapping of Braybrooke had seemed like a power move at the time, but it ended with Fulk losing his entire position in England. Turns out, kidnapping royal officials has consequences. Let's meander back to the continent now, to the Holy Land during the Crusades. This is where we meet Reynold de Chatillon, a man whose entire life was essentially one long exercise in poor decision-making and spectacular revenge plots. Reynold was a minor French knight who went on the Second Crusade and decided to stay in the Crusader states. He managed to marry Constance of Antioch, a princess, which elevated him from nobody to Prince of Antioch, practically overnight. This would have been a good time for Reynold to consolidate power, make alliances, and govern wisely. Instead, he decided to attack Cyprus. Cyprus was Christian at the time, ruled by the Byzantine Empire, which was theoretically allied with the Crusader states. Ranald didn't care. He thought the Byzantine emperor had insulted him somehow. Sources are vague on details, so he launched a raid on Cyprus that was shocking even by Crusader standards. His men pillaged the island, massacred civilians, and allegedly cut off the nose of the Orthodox Patriarch. The Byzantine emperor was, understandably, less than pleased. Neither was anyone else. Reynold had just attacked fellow Christians for purely personal reasons, during a period when the Crusader states were surrounded by Muslim powers who would have been happy to see them destroyed. Strategic thinking was not Reynold's strong suit. Reynold's career of violent revenge continued when he was captured by Muslim forces and spent 16 years as a prisoner. Most people would have taken this time to reflect on their choices. Reynold emerged from captivity in 1176 and immediately resumed antagonizing everyone. He married another heiress, his first wife, having died while he was imprisoned, and became Lord of Kerak, a castle that controlled important trade routes. From Kerak, Ranald launched raids on Muslim caravans, breaking truces that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had carefully negotiated. He attacked pilgrims going to Mecca. He even tried to launch a naval raid into the Red Sea to attack Mecca and Medina directly, which was so provocative that Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, made it his personal mission to destroy Reynold specifically. Saladin called Reynold the most perfidious and disbelieving of all the Franks. Coming from someone who had to deal with decades of Crusader violence, that's saying something. Saladin swore he would personally kill Reynold if he ever captured him. This was not an idle threat. In 1187, Reynold participated in the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin decisively defeated the Crusader army. King Guy of Jerusalem and Reynold were both captured. Saladin brought them to his tent, offered water to the king, a sign of mercy in the tradition of the time, and then turned to He reminded Reynold of all his crimes, all his broken truces, all his provocations, and then Saladin personally beheaded him. Reynold's decades of violent revenge against anyone he felt had slighted him ended with his execution at the hands of the man he'd spent years antagonizing. His body was left where it fell as a warning. The castle of Korok surrendered shortly afterward. Ranald's personal vendettas had accomplished nothing except his own death and the weakening of the Crusader states. Let's drift now to Scandinavia, where revenge wasn't just personal, it was a matter of family honor that could span generations. This is where we meet the saga of the Sverris and their rivals, a feud that consumed Norway for decades in the 12th and 13th centuries. Sverre Sigurdsson claimed to be the illegitimate son of King Sigurd II of Norway, though this was disputed by basically everyone. He was raised by a stepfather in the Faroe Islands, trained as a priest, and seemed destined for a quiet religious life. Then, in his 20s, his mother allegedly told him about his supposed royal parentage, and Sverre decided that being a priest was too boring. He wanted to be king instead. The problem was that Norway already had a king. King Magnus V. Magnus was young, legitimate, and supported by the church and most of the nobility Sverre had audacity and a small group of rebels called the Berkliks, named for the birch bark they wrapped around their legs for warmth because they were too poor to afford proper boots. Not exactly a power base. Sverre spent the next decade fighting a civil war against Magnus. The Berklegs were outnumbered and out-resourced, but Sverre was a surprisingly good military commander. He won battles he had no business winning. He recruited more followers by promising them land and power when he became king. And in 1184, he killed Magnus at the Battle of Fimrite. You'd think that would be the end of it. Sverre was now king. Magnus was dead. Time to govern Norway and enjoy the fruits of victory. But no, Magnus's supporters refused to accept Sverre's rule. The church excommunicated him. Various rival claimants to the throne kept appearing, all insisting they had better royal credentials than the former priest from the Faroes. Sverre spent his entire 20-year reign fighting off challenges to his rule. He fought the church, which supported his rivals. He fought Norwegian nobles who thought he was an upstart. He even fought Danish forces who decided to interfere in Norwegian politics. Every victory just created new enemies who wanted revenge for the last defeat. The Bishop of Oslo, a man named Nicholas, became Sverre's particular nemesis. Nicholas excommunicated Sverre multiple times. Once apparently wasn't enough and preached sermons denouncing him as a false king and a heretic. Sverre responded by confiscating church property, which made Nicholas even angrier. This went back and forth for years in an ecclesiastical feud that benefited absolutely no one. Sverre died in 1202, possibly of old age, possibly from illness, definitely exhausted from 2 decades of constant warfare. His son Håkon III succeeded him and immediately had to deal with more civil war, because the people who hated Sverre now hated his son too. The feud continued through Håkon's short reign and into the reign of Håkon IV, Sverre's grandson, who finally managed to establish peace in 1240. That's 60 years of civil war, all because one man claimed to be royal and everyone else disagreed. Generations of Norwegians died in battles fighting over whose version of events was correct. The revenge of Magnus's supporters against Sverre's line consumed decades and countless lives, and in the end, Sverre's dynasty won anyway because they were marginally better at political violence. Let's wander south now to the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, where we encounter King Peter III, also known as the Great, though whether he deserved that epithet is debatable. Peter became king in 1276 and immediately began planning an elaborate revenge against the French for existing mostly, but specifically for controlling Sicily. Sicily had been ruled by the French House of Anjou since 1266, when Charles of Anjou conquered it and killed the previous Hohenstaufen rulers. Peter's wife, Constance, was the daughter of the last Hohenstaufen king, so Peter decided Sicily rightfully belonged to his family. Never mind that it had been decades since Constance's family ruled the island. Never mind that Charles of Anjou had papal support. Peter wanted Sicily, and he was willing to spend years plotting to get it. Peter's revenge plot was remarkably sophisticated. He secretly funded rebel groups in Sicily who opposed French rule. He built a powerful navy, ostensibly for a crusade, but actually for invading Sicily. He established diplomatic contacts with the Byzantine Empire to secure their support, and then he waited for the right moment. That moment came in 1282 with the Sicilian Vespers, a spontaneous uprising against French rule that began when a French soldier allegedly harassed a Sicilian woman on Easter Monday. By evening, thousands of French people in Sicily were dead, killed in a wave of violence that spread across the island. Whether Peter actually orchestrated this or just took advantage of the chaos is unclear, but he was conveniently nearby with a fleet ready to intervene. Peter sailed to Sicily, claimed the throne as Constance's husband, and was welcomed by the Sicilians as a liberator from French rule. Charles of Anjou, who had been preparing to invade Sicily from the mainland, found himself facing a new and better prepared opponent. The resulting war between Aragon and Anjou lasted for 20 years long after Peter himself died and devastated both Sicily and southern Italy. Peter's revenge against the French for controlling his island through his wife resulted in decades of warfare, thousands of deaths, and economic ruin for Sicily. Did he care? Probably not. He died in 1285, 3 years after taking Sicily, having achieved his goal of humiliating the French. The fact that the war continued for another 17 years after his death was someone else's problem. The War of the Sicilian Vespers, as it came to be known, created a permanent split between Sicily and Naples, funded decades of naval battles in the Mediterranean, and bankrupted multiple kingdoms, all because one king decided his wife's family inheritance was worth any price. Medieval revenge didn't come cheap, but it certainly came thorough. Let's drift into the realm of church politics now, where revenge was conducted with documents, excommunications, and the occasional armed conflict. This is where we meet Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France. Yes, Philip the Fair again. Because he couldn't resist making enemies in every direction, Boniface became pope in 1294 after his predecessor, Celestine V, resigned. The resignation was suspicious. Celestine was old and incompetent, and Boniface may have convinced him to step down, but legal. Boniface was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced of papal supremacy over all earthly rulers. This made him very popular with the church hierarchy and very unpopular with kings who thought they should be able to govern without papal interference. Philip IV of France believed kings answered to God alone, not to the Pope. Boniface believed the Pope was God's representative on earth, and therefore kings answered to him. These two positions were fundamentally incompatible, and both men were too stubborn to compromise. The conflict began over taxes. Philip wanted to tax the French clergy to fund his wars. Boniface issued a papal bull, Clarissis Laicos, forbidding kings from taxing clergy without papal permission. Philip responded by forbidding the export of gold and silver from France, which cut off a major source of papal revenue. It was a papal royal tariff war conducted through official documents and economic sanctions. They reached a temporary truce, but the underlying hatred remained. In 1301, Philip arrested a French bishop on charges of treason. Boniface was furious. He issued another bull, Ausculta Fili, demanding the bishop's release and asserting papal authority over French affairs. Philip responded by burning the bull publicly and calling up a council of French nobility and clergy to support him against the Pope. Boniface's revenge was the bull Unum Sanctam in 1302, possibly the most extreme assertion of papal power ever written. It declared that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. Essentially, Boniface was saying that anyone who opposed him was going to hell. This was not subtle theological argumentation. Philip decided Boniface needed to be removed from the papacy entirely. He sent a small army to Italy led by Guillaume de Nogaret, a lawyer and loyal servant, with orders to capture the Pope and bring him to France for trial. This was an extraordinary escalation. A king attempting to arrest the Pope. Nogaret found Boniface at his family Esther's residence in Anagni in September 1303. There are various accounts of what happened next. Some say Nogaret struck the Pope. Others say they merely held him captive for a few days while deciding what to do. What's certain is that local Italian forces rescued Boniface before Nogaret could transport him to France. Boniface returned to Rome deeply shaken by the experience. He died a month later, possibly from the stress and humiliation of being attacked by royal forces in his own territory. Philip's revenge was complete. He hadn't killed the Pope directly, but he'd ensured Boniface died broken and humiliated. Philip's vindictiveness continued even after Boniface's death. He pressured the next two popes to condemn Boniface's memory and pursued charges of heresy against the dead pontiff. The trial never happened, but Philip made sure everyone knew he'd defeated the papacy itself. The next pope, Clement V, moved the papal court to Avignon in France, beginning the period known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Philip had won so thoroughly that the popes spent the next 70 years under French influence. Let's meander now to England and the reign of Edward I. Called Longshanks for his unusual height and the Hammer of the Scots for his brutal treatment of Scotland. Edward's revenge against the Scots for daring to seek independence consumed the final decades of his life and set the stage for generations of Anglo-Scottish warfare. It started with a succession crisis. Scotland's king died in 1290 without a clear heir, and various nobles claimed the throne. They asked Edward to arbitrate, which was a mistake. Edward agreed, then used the opportunity to assert English overlordship over Scotland. He chose John Balliol as king, specifically because Balliol seemed weak and controllable. Balliol, to everyone's surprise, including probably his own, developed a spine and refused to be Edward's puppet. He made an alliance with France, England's enemy, which Edward took as a personal betrayal. Edward's revenge was systematic and devastating. He invaded Scotland in 1296 with overwhelming force, defeated Balliol's army, forced Balliol to abdicate in a ceremony of ritual humiliation, and carried off the Stone of Scundher, traditional Scottish coronation, stone to England. Edward thought he'd solved the Scotland problem permanently. He'd destroyed their army, removed their king, and taken their most important national symbol. Scotland would be an English province now, subject to English law and English taxes. This assessment proved wildly optimistic. Scottish resistance emerged under William Wallace, a minor noble who became a symbol of Scottish independence. Wallace won a shocking victory against English forces at Stirling Bridge in 1297, which made Edward absolutely furious. How dare these Scots continue resisting after he'd so clearly defeated them? Edward's response was to invade again, defeat Wallace at Falkirk in 1298, and spend the next 7 years hunting Wallace personally. When Wallace was finally captured in 1305, Edward's revenge was carefully calculated to humiliate and terrify. Wallace was dragged through London tied to a horse, hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled while alive, beheaded, and then quartered, with his body parts displayed in different cities as a warning. This did not have the deterrent effect Edward intended. Instead, it made Wallace a martyr and sparked more Scottish resistance under Robert the Bruce. Edward spent the last years of his life planning yet another invasion of Scotland, dying in 1307 while marching north to fight the Scots one more time. He was 68 years old and had been at war with Scotland for nearly 2 decades. Edward's son, Edward II, inherited this unwinnable war and promptly made it worse through his own incompetence. The Scottish Wars of Independence continued for another 20 years after Edward I's death, finally ending with Scottish victory and independence. Edward's revenge against Scotland for seeking freedom had cost thousands of English lives, enormous sums of money, and ultimately failed completely. Let's drift to Germany now, where we encounter the feud between the cities of Cologne and Warien in the 13th century. This is a story of how a dispute about toll collection escalated into a massive battle involving 5 armies and reshaping the political landscape of the Rhineland. Archbishop Siegfried of Cologne was, like many medieval archbishops, more interested in temporal power than spiritual matters. He controlled Cologne, one of the wealthiest cities in the Holy Roman Empire, and he wanted to expand his territory. The problem was that nearby nobles and cities didn't want to be absorbed into Siegfried's domain. The Duke of Brabant, John I, was particularly opposed to Siegfried's expansion. John supported the city of Cologne's attempts to gain more autonomy from the Archbishop. Continue 650. which Siegfried viewed as direct interference in his affairs. Personal animosity grew between the two men over several years, fed by competing territorial claims and wounded pride. In 1288, the conflict came to a head at the Battle of Worrian. Siegfried assembled an army of his supporters, various counts, bishops, and nobles who backed his claims. John of Brabant gathered his own coalition of cities and nobles who opposed archiepiscopal power. It was less a battle and more a giant settling of scores between everyone in the Rhineland who had grudges against each other. The battle itself was chaos, thousands of men fighting in close combat with no clear battle lines. Siegfried's forces were defeated, and Siegfried himself was captured. This was humiliating for an archbishop being taken prisoner by laymen and held for ransom like a common noble. He spent a year in captivity before being released in exchange for massive concessions. The aftermath of Worrian reshaped Rhenish politics for generations. Cologne gained its independence from the archbishop, becoming a free imperial city. Siegfried lost most of his temporal power and spent the rest of his reign as a diminished figure. John of Brabant expanded his influence across the lower Rhineland. Dozens of nobles who'd backed Siegfried found their lands confiscated or their power broken. But the revenge didn't end with the battle. Siegfried's successor spent decades trying to regain the power and territory lost at Worrian. The archbishops of Cologne feuded with the city of Cologne for centuries afterward, each side remembering how the other had betrayed them. A single battle fought over pride and territorial ambitions created institutional grudges that outlasted everyone who actually participated. Let's meander to Hungary now, where we find the delightfully named bloody encounter at the crossroads, a revenge killing that sparked a civil war. This is the story of Andrew III of Hungary and his attempts to centralize royal power against powerful noble families who preferred being left alone to rule their own territories like petty kings. The CSK family was particularly powerful in western Hungary. Matthew CSK controlled vast territories and commanded his own private army. He paid lip service to royal authority, but effectively governed as an independent ruler. When Andrew tried to assert actual control over Hungary, Matthew treated this as a personal insult. The conflict escalated when Andrew's men ambushed and killed several of Matthew's followers at a crossroads in 1298. Whether this was murder or legitimate law enforcement depends on which chronicle you read, but Matthew certainly viewed it as murder. His revenge was to rebel openly against Andrew and declare himself the de facto ruler of Western Hungary. Andrew lacked the resources to defeat Matthew militarily. The royal army was weak after years of internal conflicts, and Matthew's forces were well trained and loyal. So Andrew tried diplomacy, offering Matthew concessions and titles in exchange for submission. Matthew refused everything. He wanted revenge for his slain followers, and mere titles weren't enough. The feud continued until Andrew died in 1301, ending the native Hungarian royal line. Matthew then spent the next decade fighting against the new foreign kings of Hungary, first one from Bohemia, then one from Bavaria, then one from Naples. He didn't particularly care who claimed the Hungarian throne. He juxtaposed any king who tried to limit his power. Matthew died in 1321, still in control of his Western Hungarian fiefdom, having spent 23 years in open rebellion. His revenge against centralized royal authority was so successful that Hungarian kings didn't fully control the kingdom until the 15th century. One ambush at a crossroads had triggered decades of civil war and permanently weakened the Hungarian monarchy. This is one of the beautiful things about medieval revenge, the utter disproportion between cause and effect. A few men killed at a crossroads became justification for 2 decades of warfare. But that's how honor worked in medieval society. An insult, real or perceived, demanded response, and the response had to be proportional to the insult's significance, not its actual harm. Let's drift now to the very concept of vendetta itself, embodied in the Italian tradition of the Feda. This wasn't one story, but a cultural institution, the expectation that blood demanded blood, and that revenge was not just acceptable but morally required. The most famous example is the feud between Modena and Bologna over a bucket. Yes, a bucket. In 1325, Soldiers from Modena raided the town of Castello di Serravalle, which was controlled by Bologna. During the raid, they stole a wooden bucket from a public well. Just took it. One bucket. This was, by any reasonable standard, petty theft. Maybe it was symbolic stealing Bologna's water source. Metaphorically, maybe the Modenese soldiers just needed a bucket. Medieval chronicles don't explain the motivation. Bologna demanded the bucket back. Modena refused, not because the bucket was valuable, but because returning it would be admitting they'd been wrong to take it in the first place. Admitting wrongdoing was weakness, and weakness invited more aggression. So Modena kept the bucket out of principle. Bologna, equally committed to the principle that stolen property must be returned, declared war over a bucket. Armies were assembled, soldiers were paid, supply trains were organized, all for a wooden bucket that probably wasn't even particularly well made. The War of the Bucket, as it's now known, was actually part of the larger Guelph-Ghibelline conflict that consumed northern Italy for centuries. Bologna was Guelph supporting the Pope while Modena was Ghibelline supporting the Holy Roman Emperor. The bucket was just an excuse for two cities that already hated each other to fight another battle in their endless partisan war. The Battle of Zappolino in 1325 saw Modena defeat Bologna decisively. Thousands died. Bologna's power in the region was diminished. Modena remained in possession of the bucket, which they kept as a trophy. It's still in Modena today, displayed in the Palazzo Comunale as a symbol of the city's victory over Bologna 700 years later, and they're still gloating about the bucket. The War of the Bucket demonstrates the essential absurdity of medieval revenge culture. The bucket didn't matter. What mattered was honor, prestige, and the refusal to let any insult go unanswered. Thousands of men fought and died, not for territory or wealth, but because their city's dignity demanded it. And when you think about it, that's somehow both utterly ridiculous and deeply human. Let's move to one final story, perhaps the most patient revenge in medieval history. This is the tale of Bertrand du Guesclin, a French knight who spent his entire career avenging French defeats in the 100 Years' War. Bertrand wasn't noble-born here, was from minor Breton gentry, so poor his family couldn't afford proper armor when he was young. He was also, by all accounts, profoundly ugly. Chronicles describe him as having a face like a dog, but Bertrand could fight. He proved himself in tournaments and skirmishes, slowly building a reputation as one of the most capable military commanders in France. This was during the darkest period of the 100 Years' War, when England controlled huge swaths of French territory and the French monarchy seemed on the verge of collapse. Bertrand's approach to revenge against the English was methodical and unglamorous. He didn't seek glorious pitched battles. Instead, he conducted a grinding war of attrition, besieging English-held castles, ambushing supply trains, raiding English garrisons. It was exhausting, thankless work that slowly, incrementally pushed the English back. When Charles V became King of France in 1364, he made Bertrand Constable of France the highest military position in the kingdom. Bertrand spent the next 16 years systematically reconquering French territory. He didn't care about chivalric ideals or glorious victories. He cared about winning, even if it meant fighting dishonorably by refusing battle and starving out enemy garrisons. English commanders hated fighting Bertrand because he refused to fight on their terms. He wouldn't engage in the set-piece battles that English longbows dominated. He just wore them down, fortress by fortress, town by town. It was revenge as persistence, not dramatic, not emotionally satisfying, just relentlessly effective. Bertrand died in 1380, while besieging a fortress in southern France. He'd spent 30 years fighting the English and had succeeded in reversing most of their territorial gains from the first phase of the war. His revenge for French defeats wasn't personal vindictiveness. He had no particular grudge against England or English soldiers. It was professional, strategic, and ultimately successful. Conclusion. And so, as we drift toward the end of our journey through medieval vengeance, we're left with a strange realization. These weren't irrational people acting on pure emotion. They were operating within a system where honor, reputation, and the refusal to accept insult were fundamental values. Revenge wasn't just personal satisfaction, it was social necessity. A king who didn't punish rebellion lost authority. A noble who accepted insult lost status. A city that allowed its property to be stolen lost respect. Medieval society ran on reputation, and reputation demanded that wrongs be answered. The fact that this resulted in decades-long feuds, thousands of deaths, and wars over wooden buckets was simply the cost of maintaining social order. The revenge stories we've wandered through tonight share common themes: disproportionate responses, long memories, the involvement of innocent bystanders who had nothing to do with the original offense, and a profound inability to let things go. Medieval people were many things, but forgiving wasn't usually one of them. But there's something almost comforting in these stories, isn't there? These people felt things deeply. An insult from decades ago still stung. A murdered family member was never forgotten. They might have been violent, vindictive, and exhaustingly petty, but they cared. They remembered. They held grudges across generations because some things, in their worldview, were simply unforgivable. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can take some comfort in knowing that your worst grudges probably won't result in civil wars or the destruction of entire dynasties. You probably won't spend 20 years besieging castles because someone cut you off in traffic. You almost certainly won't be remembered in history books for kidnapping a judge or stealing a bucket. Medieval revenge was spectacular, destructive, and thoroughly impractical. But it was never, ever boring. Sleep well, everyone. And maybe, just maybe, let some of those grudges go. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval revenge, give this video a like and subscribe for more soothing history, sweet dreams, and try not to start any centuries-long feuds before morning. Hey everyone, let's drift now from medieval vengeance to a different kind of struggle, the life of Ludwig van Beethoven. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's wander through the story of a man who fought against fate, his family, his own body, and occasionally his dinner guests, because nothing says relaxing bedtime content quite like the biography of a chronically irritable genius who gradually lost the one sense he needed most. Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, Germany, into a family of musicians, which sounds promising until you learn more about his father. Johann van Beethoven was a tenor in the court chapel of the Elector of Cologne, and he had dreams of turning his son into the next Mozart. Not because he particularly cared about Ludwig's happiness or artistic development, but because child prodigies made excellent money. Mozart had toured Europe as a young child, performing for royalty and earning substantial fees. Johann looked at his son and saw a potential income stream, so he began Ludwig's musical education early. Very early, probably too early, if we're being honest. Johann would wake young Ludwig in the middle of the night to practice the keyboard, sometimes returning home drunk from the tavern and dragging the boy out of bed for impromptu lessons. This was not nurturing pedagogy. This was a desperate man trying to manufacture genius through sheer force. Johann would beat Ludwig when he made mistakes, stand over him during practice sessions, and constantly compare him to Mozart. The message was clear. You're not good enough. You need to practice more. You need to be better. It's the kind of childhood that produces either extraordinary talent or profound psychological damage. In Beethoven's case, it produced both. Ludwig's mother, Maria Magdalena, was by all accounts a gentle, melancholic woman. She'd been married before to a valet who died young, leaving her with one child who died in infancy. Her marriage to Johann wasn't particularly happy. He drank too much, earned too little, and gradually descended from merely disappointing to actively negligent. Maria tried to shield her children from Johann's worst impulses, but there's only so much a woman in 18th century Germany could do. Young Beethoven showed genuine musical talent, which must have been both a relief and a burden. Yes, he was gifted, which meant Johann's brutal teaching methods seemed justified. But the talent also meant higher expectations, more pressure, more hours at the keyboard when other children were playing. By age 7, Ludwig was performing publicly. By 11, he was working as an assistant to the court organist. By 13, he was essentially the family's primary breadwinner. because Johann's drinking had made him unreliable. This is where we see the first signs of the personality that would define Beethoven's adult life: stubborn, proud, resentful of authority, and deeply convinced of his own worth. He'd been treated as a commodity by his father, but he refused to think of himself that way. He was an artist, not a performing seal. This attitude would make his life more difficult than it needed to be, but it also gave him the psychological armor to survive. In 1787, when Beethoven was 16, he traveled to Vienna for the first time. Vienna was the musical capital of Europe. Mozart lived there. Haydn lived there. Every ambitious musician dreamed of making it in Vienna. Beethoven's visit was brief. His mother fell ill, and he had to return to Bonn, but he reportedly played for Mozart during his stay. The story goes that Mozart was initially unimpressed. Beethoven probably played one of Mozart's own compositions, which Mozart assumed he'd simply memorized. Then Mozart challenged him to improvise on a theme, and Beethoven revealed his true ability. Mozart supposedly told his friends afterward, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." Whether this actually happened, or is just a convenient story invented by later biographers, is unclear, but it's certainly dramatic. What we know for certain is that Beethoven returned to Bonn to find his mother dying of tuberculosis. Maria Magdalena died in July 1787, and 17-year-old Ludwig was devastated. His mother had been his one source of unconditional affection in her childhood, dominated by his father's ambitions and cruelty. In a letter written years later, Beethoven described her as his best friend. Her death marked the end of whatever remained of his childhood. With Maria gone, the Beethoven household collapsed entirely. Johann's drinking worsened. He could barely hold his position at court. The family's finances deteriorated. Ludwig, still a teenager, became the de facto head of the family. He petitioned the elector to have half of Johann's salary paid directly to him, so he could support his younger brothers. The court agreed, which tells you everything about how unreliable Johann had become. So here's Ludwig van Beethoven at 18, supporting his family, working multiple jobs as a musician, dealing with an alcoholic father, and nursing dreams of escape to Vienna. He was already going deaf, though he probably didn't realize it yet. The first symptoms would have been subtler: slight ringing in the ears, difficulty hearing high-pitched sounds, easy to dismiss as fatigue or stress. He continued studying music, working with Christian Gottlob Neef, who recognized Ludwig's talent and helped him develop beyond the mechanical training Johann had imposed. Neef introduced him to the works of Bach, encouraged him to compose, and treated him as a serious musician rather than a performing curiosity. This may have been the first time an adult authority figure treated Beethoven with genuine respect. Beethoven composed his first significant works during these Bonn years: piano, sonatas, songs, chamber music. Nothing revolutionary yet, but competent and showing flashes of originality. He was learning his craft, building his technique, preparing himself for the move to Vienna that he knew had to happen if he wanted to become more than a provincial court musician. In 1792, Beethoven finally made the permanent move to Vienna. He was 21 years old, ambitious, and carrying letters of introduction to important Viennese musicians and patrons. Haydn agreed to take him as a student, which should have been the perfect mentorship. Instead, it was awkward and unsatisfying for both men. Haydn was in his 60s, enormously successful, and accustomed to students who treated him with reverence. Beethoven was not that student. He was prickly, argumentative, and convinced of his own genius. He thought Haydn didn't pay enough attention to his work. Haydn found Beethoven talented but difficult. They were polite to each other, but the relationship never achieved the warmth or depth Beethoven had hoped for. So Beethoven supplemented his studies with other teachers, working with Johann Schenk in secret because he didn't want to offend Haydn, and later studying with Antonio Salieri. Yes, that's Salieri, the court composer who was not, despite what the play Amadeus suggests, secretly murdering Mozart. Salieri was actually a respected teacher who helped numerous young composers, including Beethoven. Beethoven's strategy for establishing himself in Vienna was straightforward. Impress the aristocracy with his piano playing. Vienna's noble families were music patrons who supported talented musicians through commissions, salaries, and invitations to perform at their salons. If Beethoven could demonstrate his superiority at the keyboard, the commissions and patronage would follow, and he was superior, particularly at improvisation. Beethoven could take any theme, popular melody, something suggested by the audience, a fragment from another composer's work, and spin it into elaborate variations on the spot. Other pianists played what was written on the page. Beethoven created new music in real time, following his imagination wherever it led. Audiences found this thrilling. He also had a competitive streak that bordered on the aggressive. When other pianists came to Vienna with reputations as virtuosos, Beethoven challenged them to improvisation contests. These were public events where two pianists would take turns improvising, trying to outdo each other's technical prowess and musical creativity. Beethoven almost always won, not just through superior technique, but through sheer force of personality. He played like he was angry at the piano. This combination of talent and intensity attracted patronage. Prince Lichnowsky became an early supporter, giving Beethoven an apartment and a regular stipend. Count Waldstein, who Beethoven had known in Bonn, continued his support in Vienna. Various noble families commissioned works or invited him to perform. By his mid-20s, Beethoven was earning a decent living as a pianist and composer, but there were signs of the storm approaching. Around 1796, Beethoven began noticing serious problems with his hearing. It wasn't just ringing anymore. Certain frequencies were difficult to distinguish. Conversations in noisy environments became challenging. For anyone, this would be alarming. For a musician whose career depended on his ability to hear subtle differences in tone and pitch, it was catastrophic. Beethoven did what any sensible person would do. He ignored it and hoped it would go away. He didn't tell his friends or patrons. He continued performing and teaching. He composed his first symphonies and his first set of string quartets, works that established him as not just a pianist but a serious composer. And he privately panicked. The medical treatments he tried were, by modern standards, barbaric and useless. Doctors prescribed almond oil drops, cold baths, and electrical stimulation. None of it worked, because Beethoven's hearing loss was probably caused by nerve damage or otosclerosis conditions. 18th century medicine could untreat or even properly diagnose, but he kept trying, kept hoping, kept searching for the cure that would restore what was gradually slipping away. By 1800, Beethoven's deafness was worsening, and he could no longer hide it. He began withdrawing from social situations where his hearing difficulties would be obvious. He became more irritable, more suspicious that people were talking about him behind his back, which they probably were, because deafness is noticeable, and Vienna was a city that loved gossip. In 1802, Beethoven spent the summer in Heiligenstadt, a small village outside Vienna, on his doctor's advice. The peace and quiet were supposed to help his hearing. They didn't, and in October of that year, Beethoven wrote what's now called the Heiligenstadt Testamenta letter, addressed to his brothers but never sent, discovered after his death. The testament is one of the most emotionally raw documents in musical history. Beethoven describes his despair over his deafness, his contemplation of suicide, and his ultimate decision to continue living for the sake of his art. "It was only my art that held me back," he wrote. He couldn't die yet because he still had music to create. The works, still unwritten, were reason enough to endure the isolation and frustration of progressive deafness. This is where Beethoven's personality becomes both his curse and his salvation. His stubbornness, his pride, his refusal to accept limitations, traits that made him difficult to be around, also gave him the strength to continue composing as his hearing deteriorated. A more accommodating person might have accepted defeat and retired from music. Beethoven got angry instead, and channeled that anger into his work. The compositions from this period show the shift. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, premiered in 1805, was unlike anything written before. Longer, more complex, more emotionally intense. It was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, whom Beethoven admired as a champion of Enlightenment ideals. Then Napoleon crowned himself emperor, and Beethoven, disgusted by this betrayal of republican principles, scratched out the dedication so violently he tore the paper. This is very Beethoven. He didn't just change the dedication. He attacked the manuscript in a fury, then retitled the symphony to celebrate the memory of a great man. The pettiness, the drama, the absolute inability to just quietly revise something all quintessentially Beethoven. And the music itself is revolutionary, expressing emotions on a scale that classical symphony form hadn't attempted before. Let's drift now through the middle years of Beethoven's life, the period from roughly 1805 to 1815, when his deafness became total and his music became stranger, more experimental, and more profound. This is where the biography becomes almost impossible, because how do you compose music when you can't hear it? The answer, apparently, is that you hear it in your mind. Beethoven's internal musical imagination was so developed that he could conceive entire symphonies, string quartets, and piano sonatas without needing external sound. He worked from his memory of how instruments sounded, his understanding of musical theory, and his ability to visualize the physical act of playing. It's like a painter going blind and continuing to paint from memory and theory. Extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure. His working process became increasingly bizarre. He would hum, howl, and shout while composing, making sounds he couldn't hear but could feel in his throat and chest. Neighbors complained about the noise. Visitors found it disturbing. Beethoven didn't care, because he was somewhere else entirely, lost in the music playing in his head. He used conversation books, blank notebooks, where visitors wrote their side of conversations, and Beethoven wrote his responses. Hundreds of these books survived, providing an intimate record of his daily life. They reveal a man who was lonely, suspicious, argumentative, deeply concerned about money, and convinced that his servants were stealing from him, which they probably were, because Beethoven was a difficult employer who paid poorly and changed staff constantly. His romantic life was, to put it gently, a disaster. Beethoven fell in love regularly and passionately with women who were inevitably unavailable, married, engaged, or so far above his social class that marriage was impossible. He wrote them fervent letters expressing his devotion. They responded politely and kept their distance. Beethoven interpreted this as rejection and became bitter. The most famous of these doomed romances involved the immortal beloved, a woman whose identity we still don't know with certainty, because Beethoven wrote her passionate love letters but never actually sent them. They were found in his papers after his death. The letters describe intense longing, plans to be together, and devotion that will last beyond death, and he kept them in a drawer instead of mailing them, which is either romantic or deeply dysfunctional, depending on your perspective. During this period, Beethoven composed some of his most famous works. The Fifth Symphony with its iconic opening motif, Fate Knocking at the Door, as Beethoven reportedly described it. The Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, evoking the countryside he loved to walk through. The Violin Concerto, the Emperor Piano Concerto, his only opera, Fidelio, which went through multiple revisions because Beethoven was never satisfied with it. Fidelio is worth pausing on, because it encapsulates everything frustrating about Beethoven as a creative artist. The plot concerns a wife who disguises herself as a man to rescue her husband from political imprisonment. It's about freedom, justice, and marital devotion, themes Beethoven cared about deeply. He should have been able to write this opera easily. Instead, he struggled with it for years. He revised it multiple times. He fought with the librettists, the singers, and the theatre management. The first version premiered in 1805 and failed. The revised version in 1806 was slightly better received, but still problematic. The final version didn't appear until 1814, and by then, Beethoven had spent nearly a decade obsessing over one opera that most composers would have written in a few months. Why? Because Beethoven couldn't accept good enough. Every detail had to be perfect. Every musical phrase had to express exactly the emotion he intended. Every moment had to be as powerful as possible. This perfectionism produced masterpieces, but it also made him absolutely exhausting to work with. Singers complained that their parts were unsingable, too high, too low, too awkward for the human voice. Beethoven didn't care. Sing it anyway. His finances during this period were unstable. He earned money from performances, commissions, publishing fees, and patronage. But he spent erratically and was convinced publishers were cheating him, which they sometimes were, but not as consistently as he believed. He entered into complicated negotiations over rights and fees, often playing publishers against each other to drive up prices. He was not easy to do business with. In 1809, Napoleon's forces besieged Vienna, and Beethoven spent the bombardment in his brother's cellar with pillows pressed over his ears, terrified that the cannon fire would further damage his hearing. The image is both comic and tragic, one of Europe's greatest composers hiding in a basement, protecting hearing that was already nearly gone. After the siege, several aristocratic patrons agreed to pay Beethoven an annual stipend in exchange for his promise to remain in Vienna and not accept offers to work elsewhere. This should have provided financial security. Instead, it became another source of stress when one patron died, another went bankrupt, and the value of Austrian currency collapsed due to war-related inflation. Beethoven spent years in legal battles trying to enforce the payment terms.